Hello again. We're moving into our second clip for Lesson 5, which is dealing with the topic of the unnegating of the diaspora, which I'm arguing is one of the central challenges of Israel education today. We can't teach about Israel and at the same time expect people to feel that their own identities are being negated. Rather, the journey to Israel must be a journey which takes us deeper into an understanding of the self. Now, within the context of this discussion, I think it's important to recognize that the history of Zionist thought was not exclusively a history in which the notion of diaspora was negated. And perhaps this is one of the significant differences between the two camps of political Zionism and cultural Zionism, with Herzl and the people who followed Herzl essentially in the political Zionist camp, and Ahad Ha'am representing the cultural Zionist camp. The distinction between them could be understood as one of realism versus non-realism. Not all the Jews are going to come and live in the land of Israel. And since not all of the Jews are going to come and live in the land of Israel, we have to think of the meaning of the land of Israel and of a Jewish state in the land of Israel as a meaning that makes sense in the context of a Jewish world that has an enduring diaspora. That's the historical reality with which the Zionist movement has unfolded in history, and that was essentially one of the key points that Ahad Ha'am raised in his criticism of Herzl. Herzl's response was, of course, what difference does it make if we have a Jewish state and not all of the Jews are living in it? The whole project only works and it only accomplishes its goal if it becomes the place in which the Jewish people function as a nation, just like the French and the Germans and everybody else. We don't think of Germany as having a diaspora or France as having a diaspora. Its stable solutions to the questions of identity and acceptance amongst the nations amongst the family of nations is fundamentally connected to a total ingathering. And we know that that concept of a total ingathering was carried to places that Herzl himself probably never imagined, which was towards the negation of diasporic culture. The negation of diasporic culture, not just as something that takes place in the diaspora, but as something that takes place here in the land of Israel. People who came from outside, landed here, were expected to change their names, to speak Hebrew only, to embrace an Israeli cultural identity, and to conform as much as possible. Now, what I'm interested in this whole conversation of unnegating the diaspora is in the reappraisal of classical Zionist ideas which didn't conform with the negating of the diaspora model. Now, some of those are cultural, and we'll reach them at a later stage, but some of them touch the very fundamental philosophical, political characteristics of Zionism. And the one that I'd like to look at in this clip is the concept of sovereignty. The concept of sovereignty, as it's understood in the context of political discussion, is the kind of sovereignty that would expect the law to go according to the teachings of Rabbi Meir, as we saw in the previous session, and not a concept of the leader as the one who can't rule, as the one who we don't follow, and not a concept of the debate that takes place over political action as one that results in the perpetuation of the debate rather than in the decision. A concept of the decision as not being the primary outcome of debate is one in which sovereignty takes preference. Now, the concept of Jewish sovereignty, I would like to suggest, is fundamentally different from the concept of national sovereignty as it is framed in European political philosophy, in the sense that the sovereign is not the source of power, the sovereign is not the source of decision, the sovereign and the purpose of the sovereign is not the outcome of a decision, but rather the maintenance of unity and communication between the parts, between the different factions, the disparate parts that unite without reaching a single mode of action that everyone shares. And that's captured, by the way, in the notion that the Hebrew word for sovereignty, which in classical Hebrew, in modern Hebrew we say ribonut, but in classical Hebrew we'd call it malchut, which is really sovereignty, kingness. Malchut is a feminine term, which doesn't refer to men, women, but to masculine, feminine, which in Jewish symbolism is very much connected to the notion of something that pushes forward in a clear direction or something that receives and contains. And the feminine, the malchut, is perceived as something that contains. Now, the thinker who I want to look at, who captures this idea most fully, or maybe not most fully, but who captures it effectively, is Martin Buber. And Martin Buber, in his discussion of this idea, tries to present us with a vision of what is the spirit of the Jewish people. What's the characteristic of the spirit of the Jewish people? And I want to argue that when he gives us an answer to that question, he gives us a diasporic answer, which makes sense because Buber thought of himself as belonging to the same faction in the Zionist movement that was essentially founded by Achad Ha'am. But let's go more deeply into it. The passage that I want to look at in Buber is actually based on a commentary, a classical Jewish commentary on a passage that appears in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 32, Dvarim Lamed Bet, is the great poem that Moses reads out to the Jewish people before he dies. Ha'azinu Hashamayim va'adabera, this prophetic vision of Ha'azinu that Moses reads out to the people. And in verse 8, he gives us a sense of how the different nations will be divided up. Right? Binachel elyon goyim בהפרידו בני אדם יצב גבולות עמים למספר בני ישראל כי חלק השם עמו יעקב חלק נחלתו. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the children of men, he set the borders of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For the portion of the Lord is his people, Jacob the lot of his inheritance. And basically, the people were divided up. All the nations of the world were divided up and everyone had their own place. And Israel has its place too. And Buber writes, in the spirit of Israel in the world today, there is a Jewish tradition about 70 angels, known as princes, who are set in charge of the 70 nations of the world. The 70 nations that Moses describes will be divided up. Each one will have its own place. This tradition that Buber is quoting tells us that each one will also have its own angel, or its own prince. Sar, the Hebrew word, functions in both meanings. Each of these princes supervises his own nation, acting as its spokesman before the throne of glory. When their respective nations are embattled, they too become involved against each other. The princes are the real victors and the real vanquished. And their wars, victories and defeats, their ascents and descents on the mighty ladder are what historians characterize by the name of history. Now I think this passage should be read, can be read and should be read in the context of the First World War. Because what we are talking about here is nations who are struggling against nations purely because of their fundamental belief in their national identity. For king and country, people ran onto the battlefield and died in the millions without even having a chance. You know, you come out of the trench and you charge towards the other side and everyone gets gunned down. Why? This trench warfare of the First World War that was so inspired by the passionate notion that the national identity was really a prince, and the prince is the real victor. The struggle is between the essence of the national identities. And so each prince is essentially embroiled in a battle. Each one is at war with the others. The essence of national identity is its enmity with the other national identities, and we value history in terms of how each one performs or does not perform its function. Each of them has a purpose and function of his own, and so long as the prince does his part, so long as he accomplishes his purpose and fulfills his function, he is entrusted with power. Power comes with the fulfillment of the national identity in the struggle with the national identities of others. Buber goes on to say that the Jewish national identity is different. The Jewish national identity from Buber's perspective is not rooted in the struggle against the other nations. For Buber, the Jewish national identity is characterized by the function that the Jewish people must play in putting an end to the struggle between the other nations. And in a passage which I haven't quoted here, but which appears in your bibliography, Buber says that the deep truth that the Jewish people's national spirit comes to bring to the world is that the world is moving not towards separation and enduring conflict, but towards unity and towards the task of what he calls the great upbuilding of peace. The great upbuilding of peace for Buber is the recognition that in all of our differences, we are a single unit. We are all in the world. We are all part of the being of the world. And it's for this reason that Buber tells us that the Jewish people rejected the notion of a prince. They rejected the notion of sovereignty. They rejected the notion of a national identity which is defined by its embroilment with others. And in the classical Midrash, chose instead something else, which is the sovereignty of God. Malchut representing, again, sovereignty of God for Buber, who was not conventionally orthodox in any sense. The sovereignty of God represented for Buber the notion that the world is a unified place. And so from age to age, the people of Israel has preserved its heritage, which is this charge of moving the world towards unity. As long as it lived in its own land, it represented the charge to other nations. When it was exiled from its land, it introduced it to other nations. So look at this fascinating distinction. Israel in its land represents the charge to other nations. Israel has a function in its land as a people living together out of diaspora, out of dispersion, an essential function. And that essential function is to represent unity by being a unified element. It's sometimes a little bit sad when you read these things and we think about the realities in Israel today, but that was the ideal. And maybe it's an ideal that is gradually being fulfilled, and the deeper we think about it, maybe the closer we'll get to fulfilling it. But my point here is not that. My point here is that Buber says, but when it was exiled from its land, it introduced it to the other nations. Meaning that in exile, the Jewish people has an enduring purpose, which is yet to be fulfilled. And so if Zionism negates diaspora, Zionism negates the very purpose that the ingathering of the Jewish people is supposed to represent by undermining the capacity that the Jewish people in diaspora have, not to represent that idea, but to introduce it. And so Buber, like Gershom Scholem, who's not going to be discussed here in any detail, was one of a number of thinkers who put peace first as the fundamental value of the Jewish national identity, and argued that not only the peace between Jewish people and other nations, which in that context and their time was already relevant to talk about the tension between Jews and the Arab peoples. But not only that is peace. The element of peace plays out here in terms of the two ways in which the Jewish people serve a function of being peaceful in the world, which is to represent it as a unity of all these varieties living together in the land, and to introduce it by also being in diaspora. This is a notion of sovereignty which is dispersed, not a sovereignty which is singular in terms of its purpose. And so for Buber, the negation of the diaspora is the negation of one of the crucial components of the vision of how Israel fulfills its purpose.